You have zero leverage as far as this is concerned. You are losing member institutions by the day. You are losing the ability to package things in a way that would be marketable to Fox, ESPN, whomever that might be throughout the course of this. And the opening line of Mike McCarthy's piece on frontofficesports.com, quote, call FEMA because this is a disaster. That's the kind of things that sports TV executives are talking about with USC and UCLA jumping from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten. And it could not come at a worse possible time for the Pac-12. So in this, and we'll get Mike's standpoint on this. He did some really good reporting on it, what they were necessarily looking for. They had hoped to roughly double their media rights fees to $500 million annually from the current $250 million a year. Mike McCarthy of Front Office Sports joins us now. Mike, how much have you enjoyed doing the reporting on this in particular? Because the subject matter is fascinating to me.
It's fascinating. It's the professionalization of college sports, really. We all know that, this idea that college sports as an amateur business was kind of a fraud, but now you have it. It's all about the money.
So that's an incredibly, realistic view of everything that's happened. And you would think that most people would be able to come to terms with that concept. But, I mean, especially in our part of the country, Mike, people despise everything that is happening with college athletics, even if this is what's been bubbling under the surface for decades upon decades of the way that this has been run. Why do you think people are so loath to kind of accept what is the new reality of college sports?
Well, because we all like to think of sports as this noble and pure undertaking, a relief from the corruption and venal politics of life. But then when you realize how the sausage gets made and how these college conferences and the NCAA will sell out 50-year-old rivalries, so they can cash an extra buck, you realize that, sports is just as bad as everything else, maybe worse. I mean, now we've got conferences where, some college softball player is going to travel 3,000 miles from L.A. to Jersey to play a softball game. It's ridiculous.
At M. McCarthy, REV is where you can follow him on Twitter. You can read his reporting on the Pac-12 conference and what's happening with them during the middle of them trying to renegotiate their media rights at frontofficesports.com. Mike, you've been doing this for a minute. So have you had a crystallizing moment at some point in your career where you kind of realized that too, where, we're going to cover this. There's not a ton of great reporting, it would seem, outside of Front Office Sports and a couple of other outlets that really get into the nitty-gritty business details, whether that's because there's not necessarily an attention span for it or anything else is a different conversation entirely. But what was the moment that kind of crystallized what you just described to you about, the romanticization of sports and how it's not necessarily all that?
It happened 20 years ago when I was a reporter at USA Today, and I started covering sports business for the sports section. And all these old school editors were like, this isn't a story, this isn't a story, this is a story. I was like, this is the story. This is what's driving the whole business. And, it proved to be right, because we would do stories about sports TV or sports business, and they would be the most read stories on the website. Not their story about, this up-and-coming left-hander, with an Uncle Charlie like you wouldn't believe. So that was really an eye-opener for me, which is not only how much business drives sports, but how many people are interested in sports business.
Yeah. The opening line of your article on this Pac-12 situation, Pac-12, USC, UCLA, opting to defect for the Big Ten, quote, call FEMA because this is a disaster. It's a hell of a way to hook a reader. You know what you're doing, Mike. I'll give you that. What are the details of how you got that quote and what conversation is being had among sports television executives right now?
That was from a TV executive who's directly involved in the talks. And what he, and it was a he, was saying was, this couldn't come at the worst possible time.
Yeah.
Here it is. Their rights are up in 2024. They're literally just about to go to the market, trying to double their fees from $250 million to $500 million, and they lose their two biggest schools and the LA TV market. I mean, they'd be lucky. You know what I mean? I don't know what they're going to get for the TV rights at this point. I don't even know if there's going to be a Pac-12 at this point, to get any rights. I mean, it could merge with the Big 12 or who else. So, I mean, timing is everything in life and business, and this couldn't be worse timing. It is, as he said, a complete disaster.
The whole thing is fascinating because the state that Larry Scott, the former commissioner, kind of left the Pac-12 in has, and not to put all of the ills on him, but it does seem like the current commissioner, George Kliavkoff, is having to clean up a mess that was not necessarily of his own making and all of a sudden just snowballed in his situation. What should the audience look for that comes next as far as this story is concerned, specifically as it relates to the Pac-12?
I think what we should look for is a major realignment of college sports into a couple of super conferences. You know what I mean? I would give it a 50-50 proposition if the Pac-12 even exists a couple of years from now, or if it's merged into the Big 12 or there's some other deal. It's just, you know what I mean? Half empty stands, late night games. They're not winning championships anymore. These schools can't continue to look at their brethren in the Midwest and ask themselves, why are they getting $100 million in rights fees, and while we're getting $20 million?
Right.
I mean, schools operate. I mean, they're completely know what everybody else is getting in terms of money. So if you're Oregon or one of these other schools, you want some of that Big Ten money. You want some of that SEC money. You want some of that Big 12 money. And they're going to follow the money, just like they did in, in that great Watergate money. Follow the money, and these schools are going to follow the money.
It's a very timely reference. Mike McCarthy of Front Office Sports here with us on 104.5 The Zone. So as we all kind of wait for the next domino to fall, Mike, because of course this is not just Pac-12 has its role to play in all of this, but this is a much larger scale situation across college football, or college athletics rather, football being a big driving force in all of this. Notre Dame as an independent and the ACC, who have a substantial grant of rights agreement still on the table, but according to several reports are, basically just waiting on the call, and then they'll figure it out in court after the fact should they need to make moves. What becomes the more interesting storyline to you? They all have, I think, a significant amount of intrigue, but I think that there's a couple of these avenues from your standpoint that the audience might be curious about.
I'm the most fascinated about Notre Dame. No mystery there. I'm an Irish guy, and I've always been fascinated by Notre Dame. And it seems to me that the Irish are even gaining more power in this. That, they've always been powerful as the only independent that can, command their own TV contract and all that. But now everybody's going to be on their knees begging for the Irish to join their conference.
Yeah.
So that's the one I'm really going to be following, is what happens next with Notre Dame, and does Notre Dame football finally join a conference?
It does seem to be trending that way. Finally, Mike, and we appreciate you spending some of your time with us this morning. Is there any incentive whatsoever for the remaining Pac-12 institutions, I guess the 10 of them, that are still currently committed to the conference? Is there any incentive for them to kind of, sit back and wait as opposed to taking calls from the Big 12 the way that it seems at least 6 of them have done so far?
I'd be on the phone to the Big 12 yesterday.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any incentive to doing nothing. Doing nothing is a recipe for disaster. Doing nothing is what the Pac-12 has done for the last decade, and look where it got them. Nowhere.
If you're not growing, you're dying. That certainly seems to be the case for the Pac-12. Mike McCarthy, Front Office Sports, always doing great reporting around this stuff. Mike, we really appreciate you spending some time. Thank you very much, sir.
Hey, my pleasure, and thank you for inviting Front Office Sports.